Hello, everyone, and thanks so much for being here. My name is Paul Zizka, and I'm a professional outdoor photographer based out of Banff, Alberta, in the heart of the Canadian Rockies. And I'm thrilled to be back at Profusion. It's such a wonderful event. I was delighted to see that it's still happening this year, regardless of everything else that's going on in the world. So thanks to Vistec for making it happen. I'm very thankful for the opportunity to be able to talk to you all today. So good to be back. I will start by providing you with a little bit of background regarding my photography. I specialize in adventure, landscape, and astrophotography, and I spend a lot of time shooting in low light environments, adverse weather, and remote places. So that'll make sense as I move forward with my talk here. I've been a professional photographer for over 10 years now, and I've been a Canon shooter since my very beginnings. And as much as 2020 has definitely been a challenging year for the vast majority of us, I think it's fair to say that it's been a phenomenal year for us Canon shooters with the R5, R6 coming out, all of the amazing RF glass among lots of other products. I've had the chance to integrate much of that gear into my workflow, my process now for several months. And what I want to do today is share with you all the positive ways in which that new gear has really impacted my work. And so I want to do that by sharing with you a lot of the work that I created with the gear over the last 6 months. And I've got a lot of exciting things to show you. So without further ado, let's jump right into it.
I want to kick it off by talking about the R5, which is a camera often described to other photographers as the camera that has it all. For my purposes, anyways. And the first feature I want to talk about, I want to underline, is the incredible in-body image stabilization, also known as IBIS. 5 stops of stabilization, which for me really changes the game. And of course, with certain RF lenses, you can add several additional stops to that. That is a lot of stabilization. So how does that affect my own work? Well, of course, it means that no matter the situation, I'm going to end up with significantly more sharpness in my photographs than I'm accustomed to. And I've really noticed that over and over again over the last few months upon getting home and inspecting my images carefully. But it also means that I have a lot more breathing room when it comes to choosing my settings in the field, and that's really important, right? Because if I have that extra stabilization and I'm no longer nearly as concerned about a loss of sharpness, that means I have the luxury, for example, of lowering my ISO considerably and essentially getting the same shot I would have in the past, but with much less noise. Or instead, I might use that extra stabilization in order to change my aperture and really increase my depth of field in situations where in the past, my only choice would have been to shoot wide open, again, out of a concern for sharpness. And now I can't tell you how many times, just this past summer, while I wandered around our local mountains, I found myself in a situation where traditionally I would have shot at something like f2.8 in order to retain sharpness because I didn't have a whole lot of light available. And so I would be forced to make tough choices in the field. But suddenly now I had the option this past summer, the option to bump up that aperture to say f11 or f16, which gives me tons more depth of field without sacrificing sharpness. That's truly incredible, and that's a great example of why I'm telling you the stabilization has really changed the game for me. It really changed the way I make my decisions out there as I create in the field. I may also choose to take advantage of the IBIS by adjusting my shutter speed, by increasing my shutter speed. That means I can even forego the tripod at times in situations where traditionally I would have definitely had to rely on it. And I can even achieve certain effects like giving whitewater that beautiful silky look with just a stable stance, totally handheld, which is crazy. It's something that was unthinkable not so long ago, and now it's possible to take these types of images without carrying the tripod around. Another example for me is on mountaineering trips. Often those trips offer a lot of low light opportunities. The days start early, the days tend to be quite long. And there's a lot of what we call alpine starts. Well, we start well before sunrise. Well, with the stabilization, I can start shooting perhaps 30 minutes earlier now in the morning, pre-sunrise. And similarly, at the end of the day, I can keep shooting for roughly another 30 minutes before tripod is finally warranted. So for me, being able to use that in-body image stabilization in order to trade in 5 or more stops of aperture or ISO or shutter speed or a blend of all of the above, that's really revolutionized the way that I work out there, and it's really given me a lot of creative freedom. The next feature I want to bring to your attention is the low light performance of the R5. I'll be honest, I was a little bit concerned about noise issues when I initially saw the pixel count for the camera. I love the 45 megapixels. I love to print my images big. Who doesn't, right? And I find that there's more and more demand out there for very large prints, for increasingly large prints. And so I was extremely relieved after heading out into the night several times with the R5 in hand to realize that the low light performance is actually excellent. And it's certainly for me a clear improvement over any other camera I've ever used in the past. I'll go as far as saying that. I personally don't hesitate now to push the ISO to 6400, sometimes even more, on a regular basis, knowing that with a bit of noise reduction, I can still print at least 24 by 36 inches without any hesitation. Another big win related to image quality is the dynamic range and the ability to recover considerable detail in post, particularly in the shadows. This is of course huge for us low light and landscape photographers, and I've done extensive testing on that front, and honestly I love the results that I'm seeing. Being able to reintroduce detail in the shadows has really cut down on my time spent blending, for example, blending in post. You know, situations where in the past I may have captured 3 or 5 images in order to capture more tonal range, and then I would have blended them in post so that I could get clean shadows. Now more often than not, I will just find myself sticking to one image and just pushing it a little bit further in post because I can retain the quality in both the brighter and the darker areas of the image. So I think that overall, no matter the subjects you tend to shoot or the camera you're coming from, you'll find there's really a big leap in terms of image quality, from low light performance to sharpness to dynamic range to overall detail and crispness. It's really, really impressive. Another feature I'm very excited about and I've used extensively in the last few months is the in-camera focus bracketing. And for those of you who are not familiar with the process of focus bracketing, the idea is simply to capture the same scene multiple times with the same settings, the same composition. Really the only difference between each frame is that we change the plane of focus. We move its distance from the lens. So we'll take the first shot where typically we focus extremely close to the lens. So in this case, we would focus on those lower methane bubbles there. And then we would take a second shot where we push the plane of focus slightly further into the frame, and so on until our last shot is tack sharp at infinity. And the reason that we do that is that then we can stack the focus. That is to say, we combine all of those slices of sharpness that we captured, we combine them in post and end up with an image that is incredibly sharp throughout, from the very lowest, closest pixels to the camera to the distant background. And until recently, we had to manually refocus in between frames. And now those micro adjustments of the focus can easily be automated with the R5, which saves a ton of time in the field, as you can imagine. And one example that I can give you of when this focus bracketing really comes in handy is in nighttime situations where we're often forced to shoot wide open because we want to gather as much light as possible. But at the same time, we don't want to give up depth of field. We still want to retain that depth of field. We don't want to have to choose between the hockey players being sharp or the bubbles being sharp or the mountains and the sky being sharp. And so The R5's focus bracketing feature allows you to really quickly gather a lot of images shot at, say, f2.8 as they were in this example, and then combine them in post to end up with an image that has impeccable sharpness all the way from the foreground to that distant background, even though technically it was shot at f2.8. And so where the R5 really comes in handy is when you need to capture, sometimes 10, 15, 20 images at night because you're shooting at very shallow depth of fields. You can automate that in the field, and it makes the process so much smoother. And because of the incredible image stabilization that we have now with the R5 and the R6, when I find myself wanting to focus stack in slightly brighter environments such as this, I'll frequently just hand hold the camera to do the focus bracketing, which further speeds up the process in the field. And I find that I get totally satisfactory results with that technique after aligning and blending posts. I often don't even bother with the tripod. So all in all, what used to be a tedious process in the field and something you would usually commit a lot of time to is now so much faster and easier. Now let me talk about weatherproofing a little bit. Because I spend a lot of time shooting in cold, damp, sandy, windy, snowy environments, it is very important to me that the camera would be as much of a tank as the 5D series of cameras have been over the years. And I think there's a certain, stigma associated with mirrorless cameras when it comes to weatherproofing and durability and cold weather performance. And I can assure that that stigma is not warranted, at least not in the case of the R5. Since I first got my hands on the camera, trust me, I've put it through a lot. I'm not the kind to babysit my gear. I not the kind to put it away when the weather gets nasty. So already a few months into its lifetime, the camera has been through a lot, from blizzards to pretty intense rainfalls, to very, very windy days and dusty conditions. And even recently we experienced an early blast of winter here in the Canadian Rockies with nearly a week of sustained minus 20 Celsius temperatures. So I was even able to test out the performance of the R5 in colder temperatures for the first time. And you know what? It held up just fine, from battery life to how fast it responded to what I wanted. Now, I have yet to subject it to minus 40 temperatures, but so far I would say there's no indication that it won't perform at least as well as the 5D series. So in terms of dealing with the elements, so far I can truly say that the R5 feels very, very trustworthy. If you're a photographer who frequently ends up a long way from civilization, or in situations where bringing a backup body is just not practical, or if you're a photographer who spends a lot of time in tents, or a photographer who goes on long trips, long journeys, or a photographer who actively looks for drama in nature, who lives on the edge of weather systems, you will absolutely love this camera. Now I want to move away from the R5 for a moment and take a look at some of the RF lenses that have been released recently. And I'm going to start with the 15 to 35 millimeter f2.8 IS lens. When I started shooting several years ago, my workhorse lens quickly became the Canon 1740 f4. And shortly after, I transitioned to the 1635 f2.8 series of lenses. And I've estimated that since I began photography all those years ago, over 60% of my images have been taken with the 1635 lens or a close equivalent to that. Why? Well, beyond the focal range, I've always appreciated the sharpness. Of course, it's legendary. The really fast autofocus, the image quality, the close focusing distance, the quality of the build, the legendary Sunstar, which I use a lot, and just the overall versatility of those lenses. It's my go-to lens for most of my landscape photography, my adventure photography, my travel photography, and astrophotography as well. And as I move to the RF counterpart of the lens, the 15 to 35 f2.8 IS, I was happy to see that none of those qualities I referred to were lost. I even got some extras, some bonus features. For one, once I got used to it, I really started liking the customizable control ring at the front of the lens, and I've since permanently assigned the ISO function to it. And that's particularly great when operating in the dark or in the cold when you're just forced to wear gloves. In those situations, I tell you, it's really fantastic to not to have to deal with the buttons on the camera to change the ISO when you can't see anything, when you're not as you don't have the same dexterity with your fingers. It's so great to just reach out for the control ring and change the ISO in those challenging situations. The other main advantage of the 1535 for me is, of course, the image, again, the image stabilization. And I've already addressed how much of a game changer the IBIS of the R5 has been for me in my work. But now when you pair that up with the extra stops that the 1535 provides, that's next level. You start to get a very, very impressive amount of stabilization. So this image, for example, was shot in fairly low light, handheld with the R5 and the 1535. Next up, let's look at the 7200 f2.8 IS lens, the RF, of course. Since I started in photography, the 7200 f2.8 has been my telephoto lens of choice. There's no doubt about that. It's always been, I think, one of the most celebrated lenses in Canon's EF lineup as well. I've always relied on it extensively for the outstanding quality, the great stabilization, good weight to performance ratio, the speed, the accuracy of the speed and accuracy of the autofocus. Of course, the durability is always something that's on my mind. The weatherproofing, and again, the versatility, just like the 1535. It's the 7200 is a lens that is nearly sort of. It's a lens that you'll find in the bag of pretty much every landscape, wildlife, sport, portrait photographer out there, and for good reason. And when I jumped over to the RF equivalent, the first thing that struck me was the size, especially as someone who hikes, climbs, and travels a lot with their gear, and who wants to manage himself really, so that I can keep doing all that stuff for a long time. I have to start watching how much weight I carry with me. And when I was shooting with the EF system, the weight and the size of the 7200 f2.8 meant that occasionally I would leave the lens at home if I felt like a trip was going to be particularly long or involved. And now it's not even a question. The RF 7200 f2.8 is going in the bag. I mean, it's 30% lighter and smaller than the EF equivalent. And a great advantage for me personally too that I should mention is that now I can carry a much smaller belt system in the field due to the barrel of the RF version of the lens being so much shorter. So it has an impact on how much other gear I bring out there as well. And the beauty of it all, and Canon have managed something truly impressive here, is that the weight and size savings don't come at the expense of performance, and that's huge. So as was the case with my transition from one wide angle to the other, I found that all of the qualities of the EF model have been transferred over to the RF equivalent, which is of course crucial. And again, some extra perks like the control ring, which again, to which I assign ISO for the 7200 just as I do for the 1535. And I find myself using that control ring extensively nowadays, especially in colder and darker environments. But I've found the big improvement for me, at least in terms of the type of work that I do, besides the smaller size of the lens, is again on the stabilization front. You know, the EF version was already fantastic. As far as stabilization goes, but the RF really takes it even further. And when you pair it up with the R5, you get such a large amount of image stabilization that things start to get really, really interesting, especially when you start shooting at the long end of the lens around 200 millimeters, where camera shake usually starts to be of real concern. All right, so let's now look at the f2.8's little brother, the RF 7200 f4, which was only very recently released. I got to test it out in the mountains quite a bit, and I can tell you it's a very, very, very exciting piece of glass. Here's one of the images I captured with it in Kootenay National Park. For one, the size will absolutely blow you away. We're used to seeing wide-angle zooms that size. That's how small it is. It's very, very compact for the focal range. And as far as the image quality goes, I've found it to be just as good and probably even better than its EF counterpart in terms of sharpness and image quality. So I honestly believe this lens, the 7200 f4, the RF, of course, will become a staple of Canon's mirrorless lineup because of that performance to portability ratio. It's really, really impressive what they've managed to do with that lens. Honestly, I think a lot of photographers don't necessarily need the extra stop of light that you get with the f2.8, especially with the IBIS that they get with the R5 or R6. So I can really see this lens, the f4, becoming extremely popular once it becomes available, once it becomes widely available. I'm blown away that a reliable 7200 lens is the size of, what do they say, a can of Coke. Is just incredible. I think the lens is a really great compromise for photographers who move their feet a lot, especially, and people who have a very spontaneous approach to photography. I think you'll never relegate the telephoto to strictly roadside photography ever again. It'll just be part of your standard kit, no matter how far you're getting away from the road. And honestly, I think you'll find as you walk around with the R5 and the 7200 f4 around your neck, it'll take you a while to realize that you're actually carrying a far-ranging full frame system because it's so light. It's truly a great lens for these types of short-lived intimate landscape scenes, and it's really the type of glass that will make you a more adaptable photographer in my mind, because you can respond to the stimuli so quickly out there in the wilderness. Now, good glass is not cheap, of course. I've talked a lot about amazing glass over the last little bit. I understand it's quite an investment, and for most people, the transition to the RF mirrorless system is something that will likely happen very gradually. And for those of you who have invested heavily in the EF system over the years, well, rest assured that your lenses will still serve you very, very well in the meantime, thanks to the EF EOS R mount adapter. Of course, it's wonderful news to know that we can use our array of EF lenses with the R5 and R6 bodies, but I'm sure the same question / concern popped up in everyone's mind. I'm sure did for me. That question is, well, yes, but is the image quality going to be compromised by the addition of the adapter? Or will I be truly able to combine the features of my new R5, R6 and yet still retain the full quality of my EF glass? And after much testing in the field, months of it, I can confidently tell you, you can have it all. You don't have to worry. I shot extensively with the EF 1635 f2.8 and the EF 7200 f2.8 lenses over the last few months using the adapter on the R5, and I honestly have not noticed any drop in terms of image quality compared to, say, if I was shooting on a 5D Mark IV with the same lenses. So if you were worried that adding one more piece to the system would lead, one more link, I suppose, would lead to a loss in performance, you can honestly put your concerns to rest. You don't have to worry about it. And another cool thing that I've been able to experiment with is the new super innovative drop-in filter mount adapters, which basically play the same role as the straight up EF EOS R adapter, but with the added possibility of placing a filter between the lens and the camera, which is such a cool idea. And I'm very, very picky when it comes to filters. And I can confirm that both options currently available, the polarizer and the variable ND, feature excellent quality glass. I have to say it's been really, really nice to not have to mess with filter systems in front of the lens, whether they're the circular screw-in type or the rectangular ones that fit in holders. Another advantage is that the filters that fit between the lens and the camera are much smaller and much lighter than anything you'd put at the front of the lens. And they're also one size fits all. So they're usable regardless of the filter diameter of the lens you're using. They just remain in place in the adapter as you switch your EF lenses around. All right, so one last exciting addition to the Canon product line I want to mention um, is the Pro 300 printer. I want to mention it because it's now really, it's coming to be an integral part of my workflow as a photographer. And as I'm talking here, I'm showing you some R5 images that I printed here at home just a few days ago. Now, I won't show you the prints here because they're impossible to appreciate through a screen, but trust me, they look really good. And especially those night shots, I was concerned that the blacks would go all wonky, but they look really awesome. And I'll be honest with you, now, up until recently, I had always ever printed at photo labs. I'd never done any printing myself. I felt like, technically speaking, the whole idea of doing some of my printing at home it just felt daunting. And also sort of wrongfully assumed that a large amount of space in my home would be required in order to get a printer that would deliver the quality that I'm after. But I've only just gotten the Pro 300 recently, and immediately I was thrilled about the size of it. And the rest of the family, the people I live with, were also happy that the printer, our home lab wouldn't take over their space. And so the footprint is actually really, really small. And the learning curve to use the printer turned out to be much more mellow than I expected. The printer and software are actually very, very user friendly, easy to set up, and so I found that within a relatively short time frame, I was really printing at home with confidence, which was really cool. You know, the quality is such that I've started printing my work for our home, and I've started giving my workshop participants prints for their images at the end of our events. So it's definitely opened up my mind and some exciting possibilities right here at home. And I think it's really going to lead me to encourage me to print more of my images. You know, it's a shame that so many of us have countless images sitting on hard drives when there are affordable, easy ways to take them to the very final step of the creative process, the print. So all in all, honestly, I feel like there's never been a more exciting time to be shooting Canon. Not since I've been shooting anyways. I've personally committed to the mirrorless system, and I certainly have no regrets whatsoever. It's made my process so much smoother out there, and it's generated a lot of great creative possibilities without taking away any of the qualities that I've always enjoyed about my Canon gear. So if you're new to Canon mirrorless, I say welcome aboard. You'll never look back. And I suspect we'll see many outdoor photographers make the jump to the Canon RF system over the next while. And I can tell you, if you're one of them, the sooner the better. You won't be disappointed. Thanks very much, everyone, for watching, and it was a pleasure to be able to share some of my work with you today and talk to you about the fantastic mirrorless system that's now available with Canon.